All right, if we're ready, we're going to start on flight controllers. There are many different kinds of flight controllers out there, many different ways they're set up. Kind of flight controller I have here is not an all-in-one. It's just a regular flight controller with OSD. OSD is on-screen display, so that means my camera, which will be up here, will connect through the flight controller to the video transmitter, which will be back here. On this quadcopter, I'm also going to be putting GPS and a Crossfire receiver. And you need to make sure that you have enough what's called UARTs. UARTs are the places you can put the peripheral items. So if I was just going to do a receiver, I just need the one UART plus the UART that controls the USB here. One thing I always like to do when I first get my flight controllers is I plug it into the USB before I do any soldering, any adjustments, anything to it. That way I can prove that it works. A lot easier to show that it works and send it back if it doesn't without any soldering or anything being done to it. So for me, I'm going to have Crossfire, GPS, smart audio for my VTX so I can change channels and power settings. So I need 3 UARTs available to me. So I'll be using UART. Let's see if I can find it. And my diagram, I got my diagram up here on the computer. So it looks like almost all my UARTs are going to be on the bottom here. So we're going to flip this guy over. Like this. As you can see, the VTX goes here. VTX ground, VBAT. That VTX is the VTX input, or excuse me, output. So what'll be coming from the flight controller, outputting into the VTX to be sent out to my goggles. And then I'll use one of the UARTs here. Actually, that'll be the T, transmit 3, will be my smart audio right there. Okay, over here, R1 and T1 will be used for my GPS. Okay. And then back on the other side, the T2 and R2 will be what I'm using for my receiver. Now on the flight controller, as we did in the previous video, I set up the wires. These will plug directly into my flight controller. This will give me all of my signal and everything like that for my ESCs. But if you don't have that, you're going to do the individual ESCs. You'll need to run signal wires. And remember we talked about S1, 2, 3, and 4. Those are signals. So you have these little pads here. That one's S2, S1. There's a ground for the signal ground. And remember, this board does not distribute power, so I would need a power distribution board to distribute battery power to those ESCs. Okay, so I'm going to do some soldering and get all those pads that I need the power and need to solder peripherals to, and I will rejoin you. Okay, so I got those spots soldered on that I needed soldered. Now's the time you need to really start looking at how wires are going to run into this controller and everything before you bolt it down and get it ready to go. One of the very first important things you need to do, if at all possible, there's usually an arrow on your flight controller that will point toward the front of the craft. So my camera's here, that's the front. Point to the front. If it can't point to the front, the next consideration you need to have is you need to have access to this USB. That's where you're going to do all your programming and things like that. So if it needs to be upside down, flipped over 180 degrees, then that's fine. You can change that in the programming. But for simplicity and ease, the best thing to do is trying to get that arrow pointed toward the front. All right. So I know that these wires are going to go here and plug in. I'll probably actually go under the board and then out that way, but I don't want to plug those in yet. If you have individual ESCs, this is where you need to consider how your signal wires are going to get here. Things like that. My receiver is going to go here. It's usually located back here with the VTX. These are the camera points. They'll go to the camera here. Underneath I have the spot for the VTX, which will run back here, and the spot for my GPS, which is going to run over to this little mount here. So that's some things you need to consider, how things are going to run and hook together into your flight controller. So do not lock your flight controller down. You've got some work to do. I'm going to come back. We'll talk about my camera placement first off. Alright, so placing a camera on your quadcopter. These nice little cameras, they're very good for what they do. This is what allows us to see that bird's eye view, the one that we all love. Cameras are not all created equal. While most of the cameras on the market are very good, there are some cheap ones out there. But there's also many different styles depending on what you want. For me, I like the big, wide lenses that give me a wide field of view. But there's also the size. So this is a mini camera. There's regular size, mini, and micro. Most of them are getting smaller because it's easier to fit smaller cameras and then add brackets and things like that to make them bigger. So if you look, this camera does not fit down here in the mounting. So I have to put on a bracket. Once I put this bracket on, I'll bolt it down. Then it will fit inside. So let me get that bolted on, and it's just screws that go in the bracket there. We'll get that bolted on. We'll come back and talk about actually mounting it. Alright, so one thing I failed to mention in the last video there was many times your cameras come with all kinds of little bolts, accessories, brackets, wiring. This one came with, as you can see, quite a bit of wiring. What do we do with all that, right? And then sometimes it comes with this little circuit board right here. Don't throw that guy away. This is what you'll use a lot of times to change settings within the camera. Sometimes the cameras come, they're just too bright. You can't get them darker. You know, there's other settings you can change in there. So you'll want to hang on to that. That's what connects to that. As you can see, there's a little extra wires here that connect, and that's what'll connect there. Alrighty, so let's move on to mounting this camera. On your quadcopters, they will have different kinds of camera mounting. They'll have included camera mounting like this that's made out of carbon fiber, and you can see, hopefully, put the card in there, there's a whole bunch of bolt holes. Different ways to mount it. Plus you can flip these pieces around however you need to get them to fit the way you want. For my camera, it's going to go in. Hopefully it'll go in with the card just so we still have that back. And then it should center bolt, and then there's two other bolts. I don't know that I'll need all those, but it's nice to have two. They give you a lot more stability in your camera. You know, if you have a hard bump, the camera doesn't move. Things like that. For now, you can just mount it loosely. Snug, so you can move it by hand, but loosely so you can still move it and get to it and adjust wires and things like that. So I'm going to put a couple bolts in here and we will come back. So I got my camera mounted, but I think I totally forgot to tell you about the other way you can mount your cameras. Some of them mount using printed mounts like this, so that it fits, and then you can adjust for the size. This is a full-size camera in here, but this 3D printed mount that I designed is what it fits into. It just bolts in right there. But the only problem with this one is I can move that camera really pretty easily. So if I have a bump or something while I'm flying, sometimes it knocks the camera down, and that's no fun. Alright, so I've got my camera mounted in there, got a couple nice bolts. Now it's time to look at the wiring. Look at this mess. What a mess. All right? So I know that this end is the end that goes in the camera. Why I know that is because I know that the little module that you do a settings with fits right into there. So this hooks onto the camera end. I only need, for my purposes, a power, ground, and video. I do not need all of this. I don't even know what a lot of this does. Could read up on it, but I don't need all that. So I'm gonna unwrap some wires for sure, because I don't need all these. Okay. Then I've got a purple wire in here that I do not need. And these kind of connectors right here. See, there we go. You can see this purple wires here. I don't need that wire. On these type of connectors, if you take like a razor knife and pull up this little plastic tab, just bend it up a little bit like that, your wire should slide out. See, that wire's out. So looks like there's another ground wire in there that we don't need. So we're gonna unwrap those as well. Okay, so those are unwrapped. This end, obviously I don't have a connector on my flight controller for that. Some of the video transmitters might have that, but we're going to be going through the flight controller. But what I do need is the 3 power, which is red, ground black, and video is yellow. I can actually take and plug this into the back of my camera. This is where we start putting things in here, we'll get tighter and tighter spaces. It's nice to have a pair of tweezers if you need them. I should be able to get this in. There, that's connected. They're actually going to connect right here. But I'm going to leave a little bit of slack in the wire, kind of tuck it down. Horrible videographer here today. And I'll hook them right there. I'm not going to do that quite yet because I need to get placement on my VTX, because the VTX solders to the bottom of this, and also my GPS. So we're gonna do those first. Let me get the VTX out and we'll talk about placement of it. Okay, let's talk about VTX placement. Off camera, I was doing some test fitting to get ready to film and realized that things weren't gonna work. Let me show you what I had in mind and what I ended up having to do. So I have a 3D printer, so I can 3D print all kinds of custom parts. This piece was going to go on the back of the quad, and the connector for my antenna would mount there, and that would allow me to have a solid place to mount my antenna. Well, as I was trying to place the VTX, I found that with this connector, move that down, a little bit long, and I didn't really have enough wiggle room without binding this wire to fit it into there. So a couple things I had to do. First, this mount here also held the antenna. I can get it in there. So it held my antenna for my receiver, and didn't know what to do because I obviously wasn't going to be able to mount the VTX that way. So I was able to get some different prints. There's one piece that hold the antenna like this. So it's very similar to the other way the other one was. Okay. But with this, obviously this piece right here just sticks way too much. So what I did, this is called a MMCX connector. I got one that we're going to leave it on this. It had a 90-degree angle on it. And those just snap right in like that. Some of them have UFL connectors. This one I got has a little bit different connector. And then to mount it, I 3D printed another little piece. And this will actually slide, I can get it on, to one of these, and then I'll be able to put my antenna on it. The other problem I had was, where was I going to fit this in the whole scheme of things? So I also have to fit my receiver back here. Receiver obviously is not huge. It's a little tiny guy. So I made a little divider piece that I'm just gonna slide on. This is one of the nice parts about having a 3D printer and knowing how to 3D model. And see, that'll create a little divider, and I can set the VTX on top of that and the receiver below. Quite nice. So what I'm gonna do now is we're gonna start getting things into place and get ready to solder things to the board. It's gonna be a lot all at once. I also have a GPS unit that will be going on, and it has a similar mount that I made to the VTX. It'll go on the other side. So, alrighty. Those are some of the problems you might run into, is how to fit things. Sometimes you have to be creative. One of the other things I could have done is I could have mounted the VTX to the top plate of the quad, put it right there. Could have changed orientation. There's a lot of things I could have done to get it to work. This is the way I chose to do it. Kind of the fun, you gotta be creative. And if you need 3D printed things, yeah, look it up, get a 3D printer. I'll warn you though, you get sucked into 3D printing. If you like designing and building things, you'll be doing that a lot. Anyway, let me get things set up and we'll get ready to do some soldering. Okay guys, so sometimes you'll get items that are just like this. Just a little tiny circuit board. This one's itty bitty because it's a receiver. This is the antenna for the receiver, and here's the wires. And we have to do the wiring for this. What's the best thing to do? Refer to the pinouts on the computer, or if it comes with one, to know how to wire it. This one, if you'll look close, it doesn't even have printing, so you don't even know where wires go. I've done a couple of these, so I know that it'll be these 4 pinholes right here for that application. I'm going to show you how to do through pins soldering. It's pretty easy. You just push the wire through when you solder it. I'll show you how that works. I'm going to pull up my diagram, make sure I get them in the right order, and we can start soldering this guy up. Okay, so I have my things out, ready to solder. Again, I'm going to be using these 4 right here. If you'll look at this little circuit board, I have a connector right here. It's called a UFL. That's what I'll hook to the antenna. And then right next to it is a bind button. Now, some of the components on this little piece are very delicate. If you've been watching some of my other videos, you'll know that when I clip my helping hands on, I've been putting it on the corners or where a bolt hole is. So I definitely don't want to pinch this connector. I definitely don't want to ruin that bind button. So where would be a good place to clip this? I'm actually going to clip right over here on these other spots like that. Okay. So soldering for through pins. I actually want this, since the antenna goes here on the top, I want my wires to be on the top. So I'm going to flip this whole thing over like that. I've still got the same 4 holes. The only thing I'm going to be really careful about here is that I don't do the wiring reverse, because it's upside down to my diagram that I have. But for this, it's just like similar soldering. It's a small piece, so it will go quick. Heat to the pad or the hole, and just touch a solder. Heat to the pad or hole, touch a solder. Okay. Maybe just a hair more on that end one. Pretty quick, right? Okay. So the next part's going to be putting the wires in. And I'm going to do the wires in a through manner, through the holes. So this is the direction on my diagram. And this end one here is ground. So I'm going to flip back over. So that end from there is now this side. So end here is now this outside for the ground. These wires, maybe I can focus on the wire, are pre-tinned. They look really nice. So I'm going to stick the wire up to the part where the hole is, and then I'm going to melt that solder and fish that wire through, let it dry. The wire's set. The next one is voltage. And if the wires are a bit long coming through, you can take your side cutters, your flush cutters, and trim them off. Be careful not to get any of the components, and make sure you get all of your cuts out of there. You don't want them short-circuiting your board. Alrighty, so we're going to get ready to start mounting things, the VTX and the receiver, in this system. So receiver is going to go down here like this, and then I'm going to put on, if I can find it, my little piece there, and then mount the VTX. So one of the things I like to use to mount is double-sided tape. It's always worked really secure for me. In fact, I got a nice little piece right here. And holding things, I'm gonna just put that on the back of this little receiver. Another way you can choose to mount things, some people use zip ties to hold everything, and I might actually use a zip tie on the VTX. We'll see. So, little piece of double-sided tape. I've still got the backing on it so that I can kind of do placement. I've got this long cord here between the antenna and the receiver. You can buy shorter ones. I bought a longer one on purpose because it gives you more options. Say this antenna mount doesn't work out here, be able to mount it out on the arm, which is a very popular way to mount these antennas. So we're going to put that in place. Got all these wires from the camera still. So we don't ever want to pinch or twist a wire too hard. So one of the ways to kind of get rid of wire is to coil them. Alright, so I got my receiver mounted. I did end up coiling those and just put a little zip tie right there to hold them in place. Use that double-sided tape to hold that receiver in place. Shouldn't move, shouldn't be a problem. One thing you do want to make sure is there's a little button on some receivers for binding. Want to make sure that that'll be accessible when you bind up. A lot of them go in automatically into auto bind, and you don't always need that, but something that you might want to consider. Alright, so next, since I've got these wires, they're ready to go, I'm going to put on this little pad that I want to mount the receiver to. It just slides down in there Yeah, it's probably going to be on an angle because the little things I'm going to put in there go a little bit lower, but that's fine. It doesn't need to be flat. The only thing that actually needs to ever be near flat or mostly flat is your flight controller. So here, I need to have, this has a USB. And just like with the flight controller, I plugged this in to make sure that it worked before I did any work with it. This we can probably end up getting away with mounting it just about like that. Alright, my VTX is in place where I want it. It's going to be right there like that. I didn't use a zip tie, I ended up using double-sided tape. Now we're going to start hooking things up to the flight controller.